He's 34. He has a full-time job sometimes. He still calls his mom to ask how to do his taxes. And somehow, every relationship he's ever been in ends the exact same way. His partner exhausted, feeling less like a partner and more like a second parent. Everyone knows a man-child. Maybe you've dated one. Maybe you've raised one. Maybe, and stay with me here. Some of this hits a little close to home. But here's what most people get wrong about this pattern. It's not laziness, and it's not simply boys who never grew up. Psychologists studying arrested development have found something much more specific happening underneath: a set of learned behaviors, avoided responsibilities, and unconscious survival strategies that trace back further than most people realize. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening in the psychology of the man-child, and why simply telling someone to grow up almost never works. Stick around till number 4. It's the twist that flips the entire blame narrative on its head. And stay till the end, because the last section explains something that might completely change how you see this pattern, whether you're dealing with one or recognizing pieces of yourself. Let's start with the psychological term that explains this pattern: arrested development. It describes a state where a person's emotional and behavioral maturity gets developmentally stuck at an earlier stage, even as their body and chronological age continue forward normally. This isn't about intelligence or capability. Many men who fit this pattern are sharp, successful in narrow areas of life, a career, a hobby, a skill, while remaining strikingly underdeveloped in emotional regulation, domestic responsibility, or long-term commitment. Psychologists point to a specific cause worth noting: prolonged overprotection, sometimes called helicopter parenting, carried into adulthood. When a child is never allowed to fail, struggle, or handle age-appropriate responsibility, certain psychological muscles simply never develop. Not because the person is incapable of building them, but because they were never given the opportunity or the necessity to try. Here's the uncomfortable question this raises. If a 34-year-old man still can't manage his own responsibilities, whose job was it originally to teach him? And at what point did that job quietly get handed off to whoever loves him next? He didn't build this pattern alone. Somebody built the runway that let him never have to land. Here's where it gets more layered. On the surface, man-child behavior looks like simple avoidance, dodging chores, dodging bills, dodging hard conversations. But psychologists studying commitment issues have found a deeper mechanism often driving it: a genuine, sometimes unconscious fear of adult identity itself. Committing fully to adulthood, a career, a marriage, a mortgage, fatherhood, means closing doors. It means becoming one specific person instead of staying open to every possible version of who you could still be. For some men, especially those who never built confidence in their own decision-making through early independence, that narrowing feels less like growth and more like a kind of death. This connects to a concept called identity foreclosure anxiety. Discomfort not with responsibility itself, but with the permanence responsibility represents. Staying immature in a strange way keeps every option technically still open. Growing up means finally choosing. So the avoidance isn't really about the dishes or the bills. Those are just the visible symptoms. Underneath is often a much quieter, much scarier question this person has never had to answer. Who am I if I actually commit to being someone? Now here's a piece that rarely gets talked about honestly. The man-child pattern almost never survives without someone else quietly making it possible. Family systems psychologists use the term enabling to describe when the people around a person, a mother, a partner, a sibling, unconsciously absorb the consequences of behavior that should belong to that person alone. Every unpaid bill quietly covered, every mess cleaned up without confrontation, every excuse made on his behalf removes a natural incentive for change. This isn't usually malicious. It often comes from genuine love, conflict avoidance, or a caregiver's own deeply ingrained identity as the responsible one who holds everything together. But the psychological effect is the same regardless of intention. As long as consequences keep getting absorbed by someone else, there's simply no internal pressure strong enough to force growth. This creates an uncomfortable dynamic worth naming directly. The man-child rarely changes because of consequences he never experiences, and the person enabling him rarely stops because they've built their own sense of purpose around being needed. If you've ever quietly cleaned up after someone, paid for something they forgot, or made an excuse for them without even being asked, comment "same" below. This dynamic is more common than people admit. Here's the twist I promised you, and it directly challenges the most common assumption about this whole pattern. Most people assume man-child behavior comes down to laziness or selfishness, but psychologists studying learned helplessness point to something different. Many of these men were never actually taught the skills required for adult responsibility in the first place. And skill deficits get mistaken for character flaws constantly. Think about it practically. If a person was never required to cook, manage money, plan ahead, or navigate conflict growing up, they don't just lack the desire to do these things as an adult, they often genuinely lack the competence, and worse, the confidence that they'd succeed even if they tried. Learned helplessness describes exactly this. Repeated experiences of having things handled for you can quietly teach the brain, "I'm not capable of this," even when the person absolutely is. Here's the twist. What looks like refusal from the outside is often closer to avoidance rooted in real, if unrecognized, insecurity. Not, "I won't do this," but a much quieter, more painful, "I don't actually know if I can," and it's safer to never find out than to try and confirm I can't. This doesn't excuse the behavior. Adults are still responsible for closing their own skill gaps. But it explains why simply yelling, "grow up," almost never works. You can't shame someone into a skill set they were never taught. That one probably reframed something. Drop a below if you've ever avoided something not because you didn't care, but because some part of you doubted you'd actually succeed. Next, and this one's bigger than any single family. Culture itself has historically given men far more permission to stay underdeveloped than it gives women in equivalent situations. Sociologists and psychologists studying gender role socialization have documented how boys are frequently praised for competence in narrow, achievement-based domains, sports, career success, technical skill, while domestic and emotional competence get treated as optional, or worse, as someone else's job to eventually manage for them. This isn't a claim that men are inherently less capable. It's a claim about conditioning, about what gets rewarded, expected, and modeled from childhood onward. When an entire cultural framework quietly excuses emotional immaturity in men as just how guys are, it removes social pressure that would otherwise force earlier growth. This matters because it reframes the man-child pattern as partly systemic, not purely individual. The specific man in front of you still bears responsibility for his choices as an adult, but the pattern that produced him was built long before he had any say in it. Last insight, and I think it's the one worth ending on because it's the part almost nobody actually explains. Psychologists studying behavior change consistently point to one factor above all others: natural consequences that are actually allowed to happen. Not punishment, not lectures. Genuine, unmanipulated consequences. The bill that doesn't get paid by someone else. The mess that stays a mess until he cleans it. The relationship that actually ends instead of being rescued one more time. Growth in this specific pattern rarely comes from being told to change. It comes from finally being handed the full weight of a life with nobody quietly standing behind him, absorbing the impact. Uncomfortable? Yes. But psychologically, discomfort is often the exact ingredient this pattern has always been missing. The uncomfortable truth is this: as long as someone keeps softening the landing, there's simply no reason for the plane to ever learn how to land itself. So the man-child isn't simply lazy, and he isn't simply a villain. He's often the product of overprotection, unspoken fear around adult identity, an enabling cycle that made avoidance easy, real skill gaps mistaken for unwillingness, and a culture that gave him far more room to stay underdeveloped than it ever should have. None of that erases his responsibility to change. But it does explain why change so rarely comes from being told to, and almost always comes from finally being allowed to fall. And if you made it all the way here, through a full psychological breakdown instead of just nodding along to a stereotype, that tells me something about you too. You're someone who actually wants to understand patterns, not just judge them from the outside. That's exactly the kind of mind this channel is built for. Every week I break down the hidden psychology behind everyday things, habits, relationships, the way people think without even realizing it. If that's your kind of content, hit subscribe now, because next week's video digs into something even more surprising. And honestly, I think it might explain you even better than this one did. See you in the next one.